Okay, so I'm just going to sort of continue to plod along and to elaborate on my general framing of politics and morality and society and how liberal democracy sustains itself within a structure in which the rule of law can actually be one of its attributes. And that rule of law is not the rule of man, is not this kind of ad hoc promulgation and repromulgation, that the law in principle is completed, which I think is a necessity. Now, I am basically in all of in all of the facets of at least my ideological framing of society, my political philosophy is essentially a return to modernity or modernism, but it's very different because it's no longer that kind of secular religion. Modernity, when it is returned to in the form that I'm talking about, has this moral anarchism attached to it, where it knows that it is not the final answer to everything, that it does not have a kind of enlightened hubristic aspiration that it is going to sort of be the moral law, and that it's going to sort of experiment towards the moral law, or it's going to use man as its instrument. In some sense, there's going to be quite a strict bifurcation, which I've tried to depict this by calling it moral anarchism. Between, you could call it the cultural hard power, the structure of society and politics, and a second cultural soft power, which is the province of the individual. So there will still be a culture war in the soft power structure of society and culture, but the hard structure will be settled, essentially. It will be and even that will undergo some refinement, but in principle it will be complete. Like, it won't be in some perfect final state. It will kind of, within its stricture, within its rigor, it will, kind of optimize to some degree, and in some sense, the law will naturally unfold organically to meet, but in some sense that is a refinement of legal tests. It's not a refinement of the law in principle itself. So the values and the principles will have enough mechanical, formulaic reach that it will be a complete philosophical structure. And so it'll be self-sustaining, and it'll be capable of being conserved without this kind of radical undermining of it, which is what you have sort of in the rule of man. And, sort of when the rule of man gets to think that it has the the sort of self-righteous temerity that it can substitute for or displace the rule of law, then you have essentially the kind of internally stressed, sort of inherent contradiction in the current system, where people can sort of play a game in politics of a kind of moral grandstanding over sort of these vital, almost cosmic moral questions, or a kind of, where people then can blind themselves to, how effective they are at, sort of promoting the soft cultural values and power and struggle, because essentially they can try to convert those soft power issues into hard power issues, and so it's very important to be on the right side of the fence in terms of how the hard, because that essentially is the problem in America, is that the rule of law is sort of the baton, or the scepter that defines the rule of law, or that is capable of displacing the rule of law, is held in the hands of a democratic body. And they have only their own personal values and the vague, because I mean, this is the problem with the American Constitution, is that all rights have to be limited, but the American Constitution states these rights in absolute terms. Therefore, who gets to mitigate them? Who gets to work out if the infringement is justified? It's given over to a shadow process that is strewn between this horrible, murky, then political, you know, gauntlet and political conflagration where you're sort of the battle for the soul of America. It matters very much who you vote for, that they share your values, because if the legislative body represents somebody's foreign values, they can twist the whole structure. And or it's between that, or the judges themselves get to essentially use their imaginative capacity and work out some kind of rationalization, which I would argue is already, even if the judges are perfectly capable and virtuous people and they have the right values and they share my sentiments, even that is not good enough, because they are still applying a rationale which is just, quite frankly, not sophisticated enough. It's not elaborated enough, because they don't have to, in terms of the principles that they are conserving when they are having to invent a rationalization as to which side of the hard power they're going to come down on. Those aren't transparent criteria that are laid out. That becomes the subject of a legal test, which is half contrived by the legislative, sort of fiat themselves in promulgating the current state of the law, because essentially the court has to conserve as much of the legislature's intent as possible. So they are trying to conserve intent. They're not trying to conserve objective criteria. So when you don't have that kind of prescriptive objective criteria, you can't be in the rule of law. You're in the rule of man at that point. And so you've kind of got everything is liable to be radically reframed by the new intention, or at least by the understanding of what the intention should be. And how is that based in principles? How is that based in values? It's based in, these people had a kind of sentiment, and we're going to call that sentiment sacrosanct. I mean, that's literally, the sentiment of man, the sentiment of humans, is fundamentally a, this cannot fuel the rule of law. That isn't it isn't capable of sustaining something called the rule of law. And this is problematic for the entire system. I mean, this is where integrity goes out the window, and it is eventually, essentially, is displaced by legislative bodies that can sort of, self-contradict, and then it's the judge's task to make sure that those self-contradictions don't are sort of ironed out, or are kind of made compatible, or are compromised in the most minimalistic way possible, rather than saying, no, this thing must be conserved, and this other thing that is contradictory to it is less important, because we've actually got objective criteria about how rights can be infringed, and everyone can see that formula, and it has a kind of priority of values, and also a kind of a pragmatic leg attached to it. And Justice Scalia is certainly a distinguished legal mind, and he's certainly, I would say, a genius in his own right. But I think that the kind of criteria that he has in his worldview, which I must say I can't fault him for this, because he is an American jurist and he has had to sort of imbibe the structure of that system. But when you have criteria like, is this settled law? Well, quite frankly, law needs to have less nebulous and more rigorous criteria than something like, is it settled? It's somewhat when these general aggregated sort of summary temperature testing, or taking the temperature of things, when you ask, well, is this settled? Doesn't matter if it's settled, if on a higher level of reason, which is why when we make reason our master, we get a certain transparency and clarity. But when we also make reason our master, we have created a kind of inhuman structure as well. And this is why when we return to the modernism that I'm advocating for, we cannot say that the law has the answer to every question. We don't have those kinds of stupid sentiments that the state is going to be like kind of secular church and that it's going to sort of be the author of human progress. The point of returning to modernism and having a structure like this is because the justice then of the state will be self-consistent, and it will be sustainable, and it will conserve its own legal structure. And within that legal structure, people will have the freedom of association and the freedom of contract to still decide their own fate, as it were, to still go their own way, to still continue to evolve in the soft cultural ambit of the soft cultural arena. And the morality of society will still continue, but it will be in a separate tract to trying to dress up soft cultural power as a kind of as a taskmaster that the state can enforce some compliance with. And there will be some levers of soft power that can equate to a democratic mandate when they don't contravene constitutional rights, or when they infringe them in such a way that it does not disempower the right, essentially, or it does not dismantle the right. This is why in the South African Constitution, the clause in the Bill of Rights that relates to equality is such a philosophical masterpiece. Many people don't understand the equality clauses in the South African Constitution. They have certainly been abused in toxic political rhetoric that deserves actually its own sort of recording, me talking about that, but I will actually get into it in this recording as well. But essentially, people have the right to equality before the law. Equal protection and benefit is actually what the South African Constitution says, which goes slightly further than the American Constitution, because the American Constitution just guarantees equal protection. So the South African Constitution just explicitly says equal protection and benefit. So there is no right to equality that hasn't already been achieved, essentially, because essentially that clause is essentially that is the first subclause of the equality clauses, or the heading of which is section 9 in subsection 9 in section 2, which is section 2 is the Bill of Rights, subsection 9 is the equality provisions. So that equal protection and benefit is, I would argue, that's not even, there is actually no right to equality. All of the provisions in subsection 9 amount to a practice of equality. And it even gets later on when it talks about being able to create policy that can provide benefits to designated groups. It qualifies that these designated groups essentially must be disadvantaged, and the state is therefore tackling disadvantage. And what it says at the state, when the state is doing this, it says that the state is enhancing equality. It doesn't say that it's achieving equality, it says that it's enhancing it. So every time you see this kind of toxic rhetoric about achieving equality, or at least in the South African context, it is completely unconstitutional. It's an abuse of constitutional language. It's turning it on its head. It's redefining constitutional semantics in order to disguise, so I mean, essentially, and people really need to be red-pilled on this point, because otherwise, we are going to be completely lost. And so I almost think that there needs to be a political message that has this kind of red pill. Inequality is not the problem. Inequality is a symptom of other problems, of tangible problems that need tangible solutions. And if the current government has not been successful at enhancing equality, then that's on them. It's not for them to then create this never-ending doubling down on this toxic rhetoric and saying, well, because there's inequality, we get to try to create more radical intrusion on other people's fundamental rights. Because obviously we just need to be more radical. We need to intervene and mediate over people's affairs more. We need to control them in order to compel a kind of equality of outcome. How equality is formulated within the South African Constitution, it is already achieved in the legal structure. It is already a guarantee, and it is already achieved. The question then becomes can it be enhanced? And if you fail at enhancing it, it's not because you need to make more radical. And I mean, this has also been disgusting, because the legislation that the South African state has made under the guise of affirmative action is not affirmative action. It's unconstitutional, racialist infringement of other people's fundamental rights. In fact, their right to equality and social justice, because they are being treated not as an individual. They are being treated as a member of a group. And the idea is that, well, the Constitution says that you can create policy that designates benefits towards a particular group of people. But, I mean, this is a group of people that must be disadvantaged. Otherwise, what are you even doing? So the idea that you can start using generalizations and proxies and racialist thinking and racialist generalizations in order to construct the law is, by the way, it's a fundamental imposition on a Section 1 value of non-racialism. And the Section 1 values of non-racialism cannot be infringed. It cannot be limited. The value of non-racialism cannot be limited by the limitations clause. And so what the Constitutional Court has actually done in South Africa, which is very disgusting, is they've said, we as the court cannot measure black economic empowerment legislation. We cannot measure affirmative action legislation against the limitations clause in the Constitution, because there's a governmental prerogative to perform affirmative action, and therefore it's a purely political decision. And the courts cannot measure if their legislation is unconstitutional or not. They don't have the capacity. Now, in the limitations clause itself, it says that only the limitations clause can only the structure of the limitations clause and the sub-provisions of the limitations clause can make the infringement of a right justifiable. Basically meaning that you have to run the limitations clause to work out if the infringement of the right is justifiable or not. When the courts decided not to do that, there was a fundamental institutional corruption. There was a fundamental constitutional crisis. They betrayed non-racialism. They basically said that the state can redefine the word non-racialism. They can redefine that value. So they essentially made Section 1 of the Constitution meaningless. You need a 75% majority to change Section 1 of the Constitution. You need a 66% majority to change any provision of the Bill of Rights. And I'm a South African constitutional originalist. I don't actually believe that you can remove anything from the Constitution, from Section 1 and Section 2 of the Constitution, cannot be altered. It can be elaborated. You can add things to it that must be in keeping with what is already there. You can, in some sense, you can clarify and you can enhance it, but you cannot reduce it, you cannot negate it, and you cannot radically alter it. because otherwise you don't have a supreme constitution. So that is my actual, I mean, this is a different line of argument, but that is my, that is literally my position. And I think that also if you don't kind of have that position, you also lead into the kind of paradox that now the South African jurisprudence is in. You lead yourself into the institutionalized corruption that we're kind of in. Because at some point, if someone wants to radically alter the constitution or reduce it, they actually have to have some kind of democratic mandate for doing so, and therefore they have to campaign on that manifesto. And if you do that, at that point, it's anti-constitutional propaganda. And then you're already guilty of constitutional damages. So you can see my rationale and the obvious dicta as to why it's not possible to reduce the constitution. Who would have the temerity? Who would have the arrogance to give themselves the ability to reduce the constitution and to remove parts of it? Because if at the very point that they try to canvass support for that position, they are committing a crime, a high crime, even a treason. I would argue that it wouldn't be treason. It would actually be a crime against humanity. Now, I understand that the justice of the state, that the justice of any constitutional system is not going to be perfect justice. It's not going to be God's justice, but it should be the rule of law and not the rule of man. That's all I want from it. And when you understand that the rule of law is a kind of moral anarchism, is not the answer to every moral question, then you get on with it in your cultural morality, in your soft power, as it were, and that people should have moral arguments with one another. People should debate moral philosophy with one another. Why should they have to use the state as an excuse to grandstand those positions? Do it in your own damn time. Do it in your own... If you care about morality, then care about it. Don't use politics as the excuse to impose it and to invoke it and to... That's the mess that politics is in. That's the toxic, corrupt, politically blindfolded, disguised. They say justice, is blind. Why are we bringing that into our politics? We don't need blindness in our politics. We need people with forthright decisions, and when they lose the election, they say, yeah, the other guy got more support, and so he gets to implement his policy and his manifesto, and the state is very, very on top of what the limits of what you can do with public policy. Those limits have been institutionally corrupted in the current South African experience, in the current South African jurisprudence, which, quite frankly, was an American corruption. The idea that the government has a prerogative that the courts do not get to decide against. Obviously there should be something like the concept of a governmental prerogative within jurisprudence that would apply to things like diplomacy and apply to executive functions that are purely executive functions, which in some sense usually comport to foreign law, or things like declaring war against someone, or foreign treaties and things like that. Obviously, after we've already inducted ourselves into a treaty or into a kind of international legal obligation, then our municipal legal system has to digest that and will digest it without hopefully subjugating itself, because it should believe in its own constitution more than a foreign treaty. And certainly the executive does not have the power to bind the fundamental framework of a municipal legal system. Okay, so these things are important, and I just want to say as well. Sadly, I'm talking about everything here. If you look at what China is doing at the moment, it's very scary. I mean, they're almost setting up a 1984 controlled society. They are at the moment, they are trying to purge any Western creeping influence and cultural liberal ideas. They don't want their people learning English anymore. They don't want there to be anything that looks culturally similar to the West. And at the same time, they are scapegoating all the failures in their own structure, in their own system on foreigners. They are saying that the COVID virus was an American military project. They've got all this kind of, um, I mean, and this is how all corrupt systems work, especially when you've got this kind of nebulousness. Um, Sorry, I'm talking about a lot of things simultaneously, but you can see that when people are trying to destroy this and destabilize the South African constitutional order by using this rhetoric, by using these buzzwords like inequality, what they are essentially doing is they are confusing the moral issue so much that any then kind of executive uh, um, forcefulness will be lauded as a kind of as bringing reason to the system, because the actual reasoning in the framework of the governmental structure has just taken so many hard knocks. It's been it it's kind of been over a long period of time, all of its principles and values have been gaslighted as being like inconvenient obstacles to an expedient and convenient political calculus. That if we could just put the normative values to one side, we could just enforce the outcome that we want, and we can be more radical and be, sort of more ham-fisted in how we go about achieving our policy goals. And so because their policy is fundamentally ill-fitting to the structure of the system, because it is actually unconstitutional, but because it's been normalized and because the structure has been institutionally corrupted to facilitate it, then they can just continue doubling down and at the same time eroding the foundation of the Constitution, eroding the foundation of the entire structure, and say that, oh no, the problem is with the structure, the problem is with the Constitution. They end up just scapegoating the Constitution, saying that these things don't really make sense. These rules are just really getting in the way. And sorry, I mean, the reason why I'm pointing this out as well is because I imagine that there's going to be a bit of that there could be a constitutional coup in South Africa around these elections, because the government essentially conspired with what shouldn't be called, but what is the name of the institution is the Independent Electoral Commission, which is essentially no longer really independent, where the minister said, I have to declare the date of the election so that then the IEC can go to court asking for a postponement of that date. So they conspired with the IEC, and the IEC also got a judge who I don't think is an acting judge at the moment, who was even a constitutional court judge, to write a legal opinion saying that if the elections were held in the proper time frame, that they would not be free or fair because of COVID-19, which is utterly incorrect. And he made a lot of specious arguments which were not true. He made a lot of observations which fly in the face of even the international experience of holding elections, of the by-elections that we've had in our country, that we had successful by-elections during the COVID pandemic, and it did not cause any spike or any significant medical outcome or impact on medical resources, that it is perfectly possible to have elections. And also what the IEC did was, because of this legal opinion, they deferred and delayed their own voter registration weekend, and then they went to court to ask for the deferment of the election date beyond the constitutional limit. And the Constitution said no. I haven't read the whole judgment, so I'm not exactly sure what they said, but I hope that they came down hard on the IEC personnel that essentially conspired to force the court's hand. Because if now the IEC says we don't have enough time to do the voter registration weekend, therefore we're going to have to force a deferment because we didn't do the registration weekend. I mean, the IEC unilaterally took it upon themselves, just using this one legal opinion, to already break rank and to try to deviate from what's on paper on terms of the constitutional prescription. This whole thing reeks of a kind of conspiracy. And the whole thing reeks of a pretext towards some kind of staged constitutional crisis. Because now if they say politically, well, we need some kind of quick legislative action in order to radically suspend or amend the constitution so that we can have our way, because, obviously the constitutional court, their hands are tied because they have to be slaves to the constitution. But, I guess perhaps they will. These are the knocks that I see these are the blows being landed, whittling away at the standing of the constitutional order and the supremacy of the constitutional order. And that can only be mitigated if the Constitutional Court doesn't just say, no, you will have the elections when they should be held, but actually says, the IEC, you are to blame for not already having your voter registration weekend and for deferring that, so as to preemptively compel the non-compliance of this court's decision. They preemptively essentially undermined the ability of the Constitutional Court to enforce its proper decision that it did make. So now, the IEC worked towards making the Constitutional Court's decision unenforceable. That's what they did. They preemptively acted to make it unenforceable, giving perhaps the politics a pretext to now perhaps perform some kind of constitutional coup. So, this is what's happening, is we're being boiled from, the wick is being burned from both ends, and the only thing that's going to protect the Constitution is if the Constitutional Court actually says that the minister that set this ball rolling and set up this conspiracy, and the IEC that did this stuff, they have even conspired to commit constitutional damages. But this is the slow denigration and the slow erosion into a kind of totalitarian, or at least a kind of authoritarian structure. Because when the law is put through this kind of abject, it's kind of like the ridicule of 1,000 paper cuts, and then so what? So then you need a politics that says, well, let's be damned with it. Let's just follow my rhetoric. We need to do something about inequality, because we've already, you've confused the issue so much. You've made morality so nebulous that you can just tell a story about it. You can spin a yarn about it. And this is the problem with the South African parliament as well. You've got you've got fascists, and you've got people. Anyone can say something fascistic because they can just chime in with the nebulous story about inequality. So and if you actually said something, if you said these people are fascists, and you said if you took a hard line against these people's political position, if you chided them in Parliament, then the Speaker of the House would probably interject and would probably say, you cannot you cannot demean another member of the House. And so when they are demeaning when they're scapegoating a whole minority of people, when they are scapegoating a whole racial group, and they're being overt racialists, they are allowed to do that because that is a political position that is taken by the institutionalized corruption of the law and the institutionalized corrupt rhetoric of the moral corruption that disguises it. They are allowed to do that. But if you impugn their character for doing that, then you get reined in, because the Speaker has not done his job or her job of living up to their duty to protect the supremacy of the Constitution and reining in these people in terms of, well, if they want to perform this kind of toxic rhetoric, you could very easily diagnose it. You could very easily ask them questions of clarification and then say, well, no, this is anti-constitutional propaganda. I'm not going to let you continue making this anti-constitutional speech. You cannot undermine Section 1 values. The Speaker should not allow it. So that we can have black fascists in Parliament, and you can't even directly go after them. That is what a ludicrous situation we are in the South African circumstance. There is no defense of basic values. It's so far out of whack. It's so beyond the constitutional order. Because as soon as they can say the word inequality, they're making a political argument, and therefore they can be as racialistic and fascistic as they so wish. And that is how we are boiling. Well, the democracy has already been hard-boiled. It's already... I mean, the question is that has it taken over enough of the cultural soft power to facilitate the politicians going the last leg and actually burning the Constitution explicitly? But in the jurisprudence, it's already been subverted. It's already been betrayed and murdered. It's been stabbed in the back by the constitutional judges. It's been stabbed in the back by the Speaker of the House. It's been stabbed in the back by the nebulous rhetoric of inequality. The confused moral rhetoric and the fake moral panic, which allows the government to not enhance equality and to get away with not enhancing it because they can systematize the blame. They can redistribute it on some outgroup, on some scapegoat. They can reapportion the accountability of their mismanagement and bad leadership and their mismanagement of tangible reform that has not taken place that is to blame. Because they can just complain about inequality. And so they can change the goalposts. They can make all their politics is about equalizing black pride with other forms of pride. And when that is your vision, of transformation, obviously we live in the rule of man. We no longer live under the rule of law. Our morality is being dictated by vague fascistic sentiments and then they tone police you if you argue against it. They say, "Oh, you're not. Do you know what you sound like? This is inopportune or this is controversial what you're saying." Well, if it is controversial, who cares? People need to be red-pilled then, and the idea that people should sort of you're being very offensive to people. This is being very controversial. That should shut you up. And you can just see how when you actually bring the reason against these people. I saw recently I'll try link. Sometimes I say that I'll link things and I don't get around to doing them, but I hope that my description of them is easy enough to find them. There was a debate in the Republican. There was a debate in Congress. In some kind of military committee between the teaching of critical race theory, CRT theory, in military curricula. And there was someone who put a bill that said that certain books and certain ideology should not be on reading lists for people in the military if it promotes that one group is more superior than another group, or if it promotes that people should have a kind of collective shame or guilt based on an immutable characteristic. So it was a very moral set of precepts. It just said that you can't have material that takes any of these stands, any of these, and all the arguments made by the other side, made by the Democrats, were utterly contemptible. They were utterly disgusting, not only because everything that they said was nebulous. Everything they said was a false flag. You could see just how badly they argued the point. It was utterly disgusting. How they invented distractions, how they invented diversions, how they tried to create a kind of moral grandstanding. It was utterly disgusting, but it was a perfect example of of how this groupthink, how this narrative operates, because it doesn't have a coherent worldview. It just has a narrative, and it can't. If you actually invigilate that narrative, if you investigate it, or if you critique it, they can't give you an answer back. They can't give you a reason. All they can do is decontextualize your position, reframe the whole narrative in order to give themselves this kind of moral self-righteousness. That's all they can do, is claim self-righteousness and not even have to enter into the debate. All they do is essentially imply a kind of character assassination. And you're not allowed to go after their character. That was the one thing that I think that the Republicans failed. I think at the end of this whole debate, someone should have said, your contribution in this debate is nebulous. It does not make sense. You have made a grand indictment, and that is all you have made. You know, you are on the level of the inquisitors of you know, of the oppressive systems in history. You are on the wrong side, and your morality is, quite frankly, without any integrity. And I would impugn their moral integrity, because that is all you can do at that point, to actually show that these people are evil. Because this is the bad faith. The you can. You see, this is it's so hard to talk about, because it's sort of, you know, the conspicuous bad faith of creating a false moral polemic is it really is egregious. And you can just see how emotional they have to be, because that's all they have, is sentiment and emotion, to entrench their disgusting narrative, which can only work if they succeed in impugning somebody else's integrity. You know, essentially all of white people are systemically oppressive. You know, that kind of, well, if they don't get to have that assumption, then their narrative essentially, and can they prove that they deserve to hold that assumption? No, they can't. They can't substantiate it. They need it. They depend on it. And it's offensive to them not to be able to defend on it. That's how racialist these people are. You know, we should stop using the word racism, or at least the people on the right, or the conservatives that I ideologically support, and what I'm just talking about right now, is we should actually stop using the word racist. We should never use the word racist ever again. We should just use the word racialist and racial. Now, that does have a little bit of a confusion, because you can get into some semantic knots, because there are some racial components of reality which are real. They just don't really have anything to do with morality or anything to do with politics. They have maybe some things to do with medicine, because, you know, there are some statistical correlations that some people in some racial groups will have, you know, sickle cell anemia. They'll be more prone to one disease or more prone to some other disease, and that's just a kind of, you know, they have a different bell curve in terms of genetic vulnerability to certain things. I mean, it's just it. So when so I mean, in some sense, you could say that there is a real aspect to some racial attribute, but it just doesn't fall into politics or morality or culture. It falls into, you know, the specialist province of, you know, sort of, and even that falls away. That only exists because, actually, I would say that medical science itself is a pretty corrupt field. It's actually a very stupid field. The people have a very bad idea about science. I mean, the idea that medicine is also a science is fundamentally problematic. I mean, every time we invent a new Frankenstein drug and a new chemical, they have to go through trials, because everyone's biology and chemistry is different, and we don't know what we're doing. And so, I mean, the idea that you can't already design a drug on paper and know exactly what the side effects will be and know exactly what the downsides are proves how much we don't know about these things. And so, treating medicine as if it's like, well, we don't know anything about, the fundamental mechanics of reality. And so we need to do experimentations to discover what the deep physics of reality is, or to find new mechanisms and things like that. The idea that medicine is that kind of groping in the darkness means that we don't understand. If you call something a science, it means that you don't understand it, and it also means that in some sense it cannot be understood. Science is the province of things that essentially don't have an answer, because all science is self-consistent theory. So science precludes full understanding. If you have a full understanding of something, it's no longer a science. It becomes, look, I'd have to neaten up some of my jargon of what I'm talking about, but this is essentially how it works. I mean, all the best things that have come from science are in some sense no longer science. Chemistry is no longer a science. It's a technical art at this point. There is nothing new to be discovered in chemistry. You might come up with new recipes. But all the constituents of those recipes will themselves already be, So science works best when it leaves something behind, and that something is no longer science because it's no longer able to tell you anything about the regularities of the so-called laws of nature. It no longer has any probative value into discovery or, so chemistry, by the way, we know that chemistry is wrong because chemistry, all the properties of chemistry are essentially aggregates of subatomic physics and other lower, other, but when you reduce chemistry to quarks and spin and quantum stuff, it's not helpful. Well, actually, there is actually a bit of a murky bridge because we don't exactly know how reality, there is actually a kind of, there is a nebulous divide between sort of quantum stuff and larger stuff, which, people want to believe in something like quantum gravity to kind of fix that. But anyway, on some fields, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. Anyway. So there is an inexactitude to these things that science has left behind. It's but it's let's say it's such a tiny sort of rounding error of mismatch with reality that it's fine and it functions well enough as a technical art. It's in the same way that you can use Newtonian formula and Newtonian force methodology, and you can get away with not using Einstein's sort of general relativity issues. Even though if we were to be actually correct, we would have to use Einstein formula and not Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is all wrong, but it's close enough. So we can just create a technical art out of it. It would be very nice if we could create a technical art out of medicine. But it's not a technical art in some sense. It's prone to experimental science. That's an indictment against the field. People don't realize this. But anyway, and so what people do to try to deal with medicine then is they actually do the worst thing possible. It's instead of saying, okay, well, let's subdivide people into different groups. Maybe we should actually have medicine based on your blood type. Maybe we should have medicine based on your blood type plus some genetic markers, and we should have completely, whenever we trial any drug, we should actually be looking at those groups and testing those groups and not just the general population, using other stupid generalizations like even racial groups. Like, yes, there will be, obviously if you take the median of each group, if you take the average of each subgroup, it's almost arbitrary what subdivision you made. The average will always be different. Unless it's the same group of people, the average is going to be different. It just depends on how exactly you're going to be measuring the thing that you're measuring. So the idea that like you can make a conglomerated reading and say, okay, well, this leads also to the point that they use in identity politics, is they say, look at the differential outcomes in the statistics. It's utterly meaningless. Unless you're going to interrogate each individual that made up that statistic and make a reprocessed decision, a reprocessed understanding. Well, this individual, they did more poorly. Well, did they, because they were kicked out for disciplinary reasons. But if you look at the same disciplinary thing, other people don't get kicked out as much as this group gets kicked out. But if we actually look at each individual, we actually notice that there were individual factoids. There were individual factors in the case which stood out, that made sense, that then this group of people had individuals that did things that were the same offense but were actually more egregious, or were actually, no, they don't make that kind of qualitative assessment. They just said if the statistic is not in alignment, is not equal, then the system must be racist. There is a racial assumption in that when you group people based on race and you look at them statistically, that you are diagnosing an inherent systemic diluted blame, that there is intrinsically a kind of diluted blame for this and not an individual blame. There's a revulsion towards looking at the individual as something that actually has integrity. They actually are assuming that the group has the moral consideration, and the individual is just a reflection of the moral consideration that's vested in the group. And therefore, if the individual is not being treated well enough so that the group on the whole is given the same group pride, then that is the problem that we need to tackle as a political structure or as a legal structure. And as soon as you do that, you have no reason, you have no morality, you have no normative standards, you have no common values anymore. You have racialist values fundamentally. You've just thrown everything away. And in some sense, this is probably against the 14th Amendment. But these people don't care, because they've got a narrative, and that narrative confers on them unaccountability, because they can just scapegoat and divert blame onto whoever they so wish. So, okay, I understand that I'm jumping around to so many different things, but they are thematically the same. That's why I said it years and years and years ago. I said how science operates as a kind of intellectual mafia, holding this kind of moral superiority, intellectual superiority. They kind of claim this kind of, that they are the experts of reality. They are the experts of telling you the correct answer to the question. And they use this intellectual superiority and authority which they took over culture, and they abused it by creating nebulousness, by, the Sam Harrises of the world, who will give you this little song and dance as to why we can turn this into a calculation, why you have to follow his prescription. That he's got the utilitarian consequentialist formula for maximizing the human condition. These people are fundamentally amoral in some epistemological pluralist sense. They don't believe in the truth. They believe in many truths in some sense. And the idea is that we all have to huddle under their expertise in order to maximize and in order to be linked together, that we all have to be yoked under a common secular religion, and they have the keys, and they have the and this should be a cultural thing. This should be part of the soft culture, and the hard power of the state needs to have a sustainable justice system that is capable of rebuffing these people, that is capable of not falling into that kind of manipulative mind control. And this is the problem also of America. America is completely beholden to experts. You'll get experts into courts, and the experts will say these things, and the legislation is written so poorly that the expert will essentially, the guidance of the expert will just be adopted, essentially, because the moral the moral structure of the law itself does not respect the understanding. It respects the narrative. Anyways, so I'm linking all these things together, and they are very thematically connected, but they are all over the place. But so and I did fumble on the point that I made 2 points back. That the intellectual authority that has been taken by these people is a directly correlates to the nebulousness and the confusion that they inject into the understanding. They are subjugating the understanding to a narrative. That is the overarching tendency of this. This is how the Constitutional Court judges in South Africa have subjugated their values that they have a duty to uphold, the Section 1 values of the Constitution. They have sacrificed non-racialism to the government under the auspices of the governmental prerogative. They created a semantic narrative about, well, the government must have a prerogative because the equality clause actually says, one of the equality clauses, that they can create a policy that designates some kind of treatment towards a group, towards a designated group. Never mind that designated group actually has to pass muster of the limitations clause. They said, no. This is justifiable in a democracy, that if the Constitution says that they're allowed to do it, then we don't have to do our job of actually invigilating it and seeing if it passes muster. They just hand themselves an excuse. That's how narratives and making an issue convoluted, that's how it works. That's how you throw muck and mud into the issue. And create a smokescreen of semantics. Is that you I've just lost my own thread. Is that you negate something. How it works is that it oh yeah, I guess you just sort of you redefine a word. You just sort of create a rationalization around the meaning of things, around the understanding of things, or you subjugate the understanding to a kind of semantic, definitional, contrived limit, or that's what that word means. You decontextualize, essentially. So you just kind of rely on some kind of objective authority of what the word actually means. And your substantiation for relying on that interpretation you just kind of, you just assume that you hold the default. You don't actually, there is a kind of murky self-inconsistency, or it's not technically an inconsistency, but it's a kind of bad faith. The reason why I say that it's kind of like a self-inconsistency or a self-contradiction is just because you proceed from the assumption that you're already correct. You have the outcome that you want, and then you just reason towards that outcome. It's motivated reasoning, as they say. And you can tell when a legal decision has motivated reasoning. And this is also why I believe also that the judiciary needs to be the strongest branch of government, because if it has enough values and principles, and the framework is robust enough and it is complete in principle, like the South African legal tradition and system is, it can actually conserve itself, because the only thing that is dangerous then in the legal system is basically bad faith and, let's say, a kind of partisan or ideological capture. So, which, I mean, is obviously also a problem. I mean, that's a huge problem that needs, I mean, that's probably why you need to have political ways of addressing things. Although, when you have, let's say, institutionalized corruption on this level, and you also have, let's say, enough political corruption, because, let's say, there's a kind of collusion between these things. I mean, because at some point the politicians often appoint the judges. Ideally, we would have a separate system to appoint judges. We would have, let's say, some kind of non-partisan structure. But this is a fundamental problem with human structures, is who watches the watchers, and in some sense there is no good answer to this. Which is why, on some grounds, you can argue that the American system might actually be a useful compromise of basic structure. But I would say that historically it's probably run its course. I think that it's certainly been an excellent system in terms of its historical contribution, and it privileges me with the ability to make the critique that I make, and I do make this critique out of a concern and out of even an admiration. But and it is difficult for me to make this argument, because South Africa, who has the superior legal system and the superior legal tradition, is fundamentally almost similarly institutionally corrupt to America. But it's institutionally corrupted for very, very different reasons. South Africa is institutionally corrupted because the personnel manning these institutions have used the pretext of, the culture war, essentially, to overtly betray the legal framework, to overtly betray the constitution, which they have murdered. They have conspired together to institute a kind of a racialist oligarchy, and they can conveniently scapegoat the blame by just using the rhetoric of inequality, which makes the moral issue nebulous enough, confused enough, that then they can win with their narrative. They can play the blame game because they are using such morally opaque framing of the issue, when inequality is not the issue. Inequality is the symptom of tangible problems that need tangible solutions and real reform. And the government has failed at enhancing equality that is already achieved and already guaranteed in the Constitution. The Constitution is not the problem. Stop scapegoating the Constitution. Start being real leaders and having real responsibility for the history of your government, for the track record of your government. That is what is lacking. In South Africa, we have the perfect standards, we have the perfect structure on paper, but it has been institutionally corrupted and it is being largely ignored. And I don't even know how to resurrect the new South Africa from these people that have explicitly undermined and betrayed and destroyed these things, and seek to do even more damage and demolish it further so that they can build their oligarchy and their authoritarian groupthink that is so capable of disguising its continued corruption. Until we challenge this moral corruption, the state corruption is not going to be visible in a way that is politically vulnerable to redress, as it were, because this whole toxic use of inequality is a kind of democratic illiteracy. It's a kind of fascistic rhetoric that facilitates the demagoguery and the kind of the unthinking populist narrative, the uncritical, the by putting reality filters on, by concocting a narrative and then just continually entrenching yourself in it and ignoring the arguments. Anyway, okay, I'm just babbling now. Let me stop this recording. It's gone on for long enough. I'll definitely try to. It was published on the Forbes YouTube. It was really an amazing debate between the Republican members and the Democratic members. It's like a 28-minute debate. I really think it's worth watching. Anyway.